Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at the Gospel of Luke, Part 3. We begin by looking at Luke chapter 22, beginning in verse 1, where Judas goes to the Jewish authorities and he agrees to betray Jesus for a price. And now they're looking, and he's looking for the opportunity to do that. Next, we read about the Last Supper, but we're actually given some details as to the preparation for the supper. That is, Peter and John, and their names specifically here in Luke's account, they're told to go into Jerusalem, and they're looking for a man carrying a pot. It's all just a rather strange. He's carrying a pitcher of water, and they're to follow him into the house where he enters. And you say, why didn't Jesus just give them the address? Well, the answer is in the previous verse. You had Judas looking for an opportunity to betray Jesus, and so instructions are given that he might hear, but he's not going to be able to decipher them. And so the Last Supper will be uninterrupted as a result. And it's at the Last Supper that he speaks about those who are going to betray him, but he also takes the cup, and in the meal, he says, he takes the bread and he breaks it, and he says, "This is my body broken for you." And he takes the cup, and he says specifically, "This cup is poured out for you in the new, and it's the new covenant in my blood." Luke is the one who specifically identifies the cup with the new covenant. Following the meal, they go out to the Mount of Olives. Now, Gethsemane is located on the Mount of Olives, but the name Gethsemane does not appear here in Luke. Instead, we read that he goes to the Mount of Olives, and there Jesus enters a time of prayer. Again, Luke is specific to mention that while Jesus is praying, that he sweat great drops as of blood. It's as though, now he's not bleeding, but his sweat becomes like drops of blood falling down upon the ground. So there's an imagery there, and then while he is praying, now Judas, along with the authorities, he comes and he betrays Jesus, and Jesus is arrested and taken, and now we see him taken to the house of the high priest, and Peter is following. And at this point, the camera actually focuses upon Peter, where they've kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard, and Peter is there, and it's probably a little chilly. After all, it's around March, April, that time of year, and it's up. Jerusalem's about 2,500 feet above sea level, so it's a little cold at night. And he's gathered around, and a servant girl first asks him, "Are you one of his disciples?" And he says, "I'm not." And then about an hour later, another man began to insist, you were with him. You're Galilean." And he says, "I'm not." And we read that Jesus, apparently in another part of the structure, but in the next hall, but they could see each other. And Jesus turned. This is in chapter 22 and verse 61. Jesus turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had told him, "Before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times." And he goes out and he weeps bitterly. And now we have the trials themselves. So the trials now, the Sanhedrin is called, the Jewish council, and there's an examination there. And it's here that Jesus says, "From now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God." And so they ask him, they say, "Are you the Son of God then?" And he said to them, "Yes, I am." And at that point, the trial before the Sanhedrin is over, and they have condemned him, but they don't have the power to put someone to death. And so Jesus now is taken before the governor, Pontius Pilate. And here they're accusing him. They're not accusing him of claiming to have been the Son of God. That's not going to matter to Pilate. Instead, they're accusing him of forbidding people to pay their taxes to Caesar. Well, Jesus hadn't done that. He had been very specific, given to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. But they kept on insisting. And when it is mentioned that he is from Galilee, Pilate sends Jesus over to Herod. Now, this is Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great, one of the sons of Herod the Great. And Herod is rather glad when he sees Jesus. He wanted to question him, but Jesus doesn't answer him anything. And so, after treating him with contempt and mocking him and dressing him in a nice robe as if he was a king, he is sent back to Pilate. And we read that Herod and Pilate became friends with one another that day, because before that they had been enemies. So here Jesus, in a sense, becomes the peacemaker between these two political opponents. And so now Jesus is back before Pilate, and again they are accusing him and seeking to have him put to death. And Pilate says, "I don't find anything wrong," and Herod did not either. And so therefore, I'll just punish him and then release him. And they will have none of that. And he's saying, "Why? What evil has he done? I've found no guilt demanding death." And they are insistent, and their voices begin to prevail. And finally, Pilate gives in to them, and he agrees to have Jesus crucified. Now, as Jesus is on the cross, we are treated to two things that Jesus says. There's, if we compare this with Matthew and Mark and John, we see a number of other sayings, but Luke is only going to record two of those. The first of those is as he speaks to one of the thieves, and the thieves have actually, one of the thieves was actually berating Jesus as he's hanging on the cross next to him. Hey, can't you save both of us? And the other one says, we're here and we deserve to be here. And then he turns to Jesus and he says, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus replies, now I'm going to say this twice, and I'm going to say it each time with a different emphasis. Here in the text that you're looking at, there's some punctuation. Remember, in the Greek text, there is no punctuation. So let me say it twice. Truly, I say to you today, you shall be with me in paradise. Now that's straight from the Greek. But you can also read the Greek text and say it this way: truly I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise. You see the difference. Does the today go with truly I say to you, or does the today go with you shall be with me in paradise? I've looked at the other times that Luke quotes Jesus in using the term today, and I think that the way the punctuation is here, truly I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise. I think that's correct. I think that's probably what Jesus is saying to the thief on the cross. Today you're going to be with me. It's not just that I'm going to remember you. You are going with me, because he has evidently exhibited repentance. Now, notice what the thief has also done. He's declared the innocence of Jesus. We already had Pilate and Herod, and now this thief. And then it comes time for Jesus to die. And the second saying that we read here, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And having said this, then he breathed his last. And the centurion, the one who had been in charge of putting Jesus to death, he now speaks. And notice he declares the innocence of Jesus as well. Certainly this man was innocent. And so you've had Herod, Pilate and Herod and Pilate again, and then the thief and the centurion, all declaring Jesus to be innocent. Now, once Jesus is placed in the grave, we get to chapter 24, and chapter 24 is the resurrection chapter. We're in the first day of the week. Women come to the tomb only to find that it is empty. And while they are perplexed, wondering, okay, what happened? We read that two men suddenly stood near them in dazzling clothing. And the women are afraid, and they're saying, what is this? Now we get the sense it's angels, but Luke doesn't call them angels. He just says they're two men. And and they announce he's not here. He's risen. Remember how he spoke to you when he was still when he was still in Galilee, saying that this was going to happen. And they remember the words, and they go back and they tell the other disciples. And Peter, this is chapter 24, verse 12, Peter got up and ran to the tomb and looked in and saw the wrappings, and then he went away, just wondering and marveling at what had happened. And now our scene shifts to two other disciples. Now we're going to be told the name of one, maybe both of them. But initially it's just two disciples, and they're on the road leaving Jerusalem, and they are going to a place called Emmaus. It's about 7 miles to the west of Jerusalem. It's mostly going sort of downhill because Jerusalem's on the big ridge, but you come to a point where you're going down into what they call the Shephelah, the foothills, as you're moving to the west toward the Mediterranean. And they're going along, and they're talking and they're discussing Jesus, and all of a sudden they see somebody on the way, and it's Jesus, but they do not recognize him. And we read that their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. And one of them, and here we're actually given his name, Cleopas. That's not one of the 12 apostles. It's another disciple. And Cleopas, he says, Jesus says to him, "What are you guys talking about?" And he says, "We're talking about Jesus." And Jesus says, "Well, who's he?" And Cleopas says, "Are you the only one in Jerusalem that doesn't know about Jesus? About all the things that have taken place?" And he says, "Well, what things?" And they begin to tell him about how they thought that Jesus was the Messiah, except that he had been arrested and tried and convicted and crucified. And now there's this story about how some have thought that he had risen from the dead, but they're not sure what to make of that. And he said to them, "O foolish men, and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary for the Christ," and remember the word Christ just means the Messiah, "for the Messiah, the Christ, to suffer these things?" In other words, he says, look, the things that you're describing are the things that the scriptures, the Old Testament, said would happen about the Messiah. You've just described all those messianic prophecies. And then beginning with Moses and with all the prophets, he explained to them the things concerning himself in all the scriptures. Now, they haven't really put it together that they're speaking to Jesus as he's telling them about the Jesus that they have described. Well, verse 28, and they approached the village. They were headed toward this place called Emmaus, where they were going, and he acted as though he were going to go further, but they urged him, saying, "Stay with us, for it's getting toward evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he had reclined at the table with them, he took the bread and blessed it. And by this time, it's at least for us, the readers, a feeling of deja vu. We've read about Jesus taking bread and blessing it. And breaking it, he began giving it to them. And suddenly the deja vu opens their eyes. Verse 31, then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. And they said to one another, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was speaking to us on the road, while he was explaining the scriptures to us?" Now, I want you to see how this is described and see it in the bigger picture of Luke's gospel account. Back in Luke chapter 2, we'd had the story where Mary and Joseph, they lose Jesus. Remember how they'd gone to the temple. He's 12 years old. Well, here are two disciples that had lost Jesus. And back in Luke 2, they find Jesus after 3 days. In Luke 24, they're describing how it had been 3 days since all of these things had taken place, 3 days since he died. In Luke 2, they found Jesus in Jerusalem. Here they are. They meet Jesus on the Emmaus Road. Back in Luke 2, they didn't get it. The Mary and Joseph, they did not understand who Jesus was and what he was about. these two disciples didn't understand. There's a lack of understanding in both cases. In Luke 2, Mary, at the end of the story, treasured all these things in her heart. In their case, they say, were not our hearts burning within us? You see, these two stories are bookends, one at the beginning, just before we get to the beginning of the ministry of Jesus, one after the ministry of Jesus, but now that he's risen from the dead, they serve as bookends to the entire story. Verse 33, and they got up that very hour and returned to Jerusalem and found gathered together the 11 and those who were with him, saying, the Lord has really risen and has appeared. Now notice, to Simon. Now you say, well, wait a minute. Is Simon one of those other, you had Cleopas described as one. Is Simon the other one? Is this Simon Peter? Because, of course, Simon is a common name. So we're not entirely sure. But verse 35, they began to relate their experiences on the road and how he was recognized by them in the breaking of the bread. We're going to look how Jesus shows up. I also want you to see something that serves as bookends, not just to the Gospel of Luke, but to the entire Old Testament and right up here to the Jesus story. That is going all the way back to the story of Adam and Eve. And you remember how after they ate of the fruit, their eyes were open. And here these two disciples, their eyes were open. And back in that day, Adam and Eve had seen that they were naked. And here they see, not that they were naked, they see Jesus. Adam and Eve had eaten what they were forbidden to eat. The two disciples, Jesus said, here, take and eat. And the presumption is that they did, at least spiritually speaking. And in the case of Adam and Eve, their new sight was a sign of their sinful condition. But these two disciples, as they see Jesus, their new sight was a sign that Jesus had won the victory, that it's a sign of Christ's redemptive activity on their behalf. In the story of Adam and Eve, seeing was a sign of their separation from God. Here, seeing is a sign of their being reunited with God. They're coming home. Well, we get to chapter 24, verse 36, and Jesus shows up. He stands there. Suddenly he's there before them as these two disciples are speaking to the 11. And he says to them, peace be to you. And then he says, look, here's my hands and my feet. It reminds us of what we're going to read about when we get to the Gospel of John. See my hands and feet. And then he says, do you have something to eat? And they have some fish. And so he eats the fish. What's the point there? That they're not just seeing a vision. Look at the fish. He ate it. This is not just a vision. This is not just a dream. He actually shows up in the flesh. And now he opened their minds to understand the scriptures. In fact, he says in verse 44, he speaks of, these are my words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all the things which are written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms, you see that's the Torah, the what they called the Naviim, the prophets, and the Psalms represent the writings. That's the entire Old Testament, and all these things must be fulfilled. And then we read that he opened their minds to understand the scriptures. Next, he leads them out. Now, it doesn't say that this happened immediately or how many days later. There's no time element mentioned. But he led them out as far as Bethany. That was on the other side of the Mount of Olives. And there he blesses them. And as they are watching, he's carried up to heaven. So Luke's going to describe not just the resurrection, but also the ascension. Now, when we get to Acts, part 2 of Luke's story, he's going to describe it again. There's going to be a little bit of overlap, but he's carried up to heaven. And we read that the disciples returned to Jerusalem and that they were continually in the temple, praising God. We said in a previous class about how Luke begins and he ends the story in the temple. But now they are praising God, blessing God because of his faithfulness to them.